"You don't belong in this room," Richard Whitmore said, loud enough for every glass to stop midair, and Naomi Carter felt the words land like a door slammed in her face. But she didn't flinch, didn't argue, just stood there with her hands steady, eyes calm, while the room decided she was nothing. He smiled like he had already erased her, like power meant he was always right. But what he didn't see was the way a few people hesitated, the way one executive avoided his gaze, the way Naomi's silence carried something heavier than anger. She didn't beg, she didn't explain, and that was the first crack, because silence, real silence, isn't empty, it's loaded. Richard leaned closer, voice low. "Say something or leave." And for a second it felt like the whole night was waiting on her voice. But Naomi just reached up, unclipped her badge, and placed it gently on the table between them. No shaking, no hesitation. "Some things don't need words," she said quietly, the only sentence she would give him. And then she turned and walked out into the cold night air, heels echoing down the marble steps, leaving behind a room that suddenly felt too quiet, and a man who didn't realize he had just lost the one person holding everything together. By the next morning, Richard's office did not feel powerful. It felt off, like something small but critical had been pulled out of place. His assistant stood frozen at the door, tablet in hand, saying the morning investor call had been pushed back because no one could access the final briefing file. And for the first time, he frowned, not worried, just annoyed, until he heard the next line. "Naomi used to handle that." He brushed it off, told them to fix it, but 10 minutes later, another delay hit. A contract sitting unsigned because legal could not find the revised clause Naomi had promised, and no one else even knew where she kept those edits. Emails started stacking, short, tense, unanswered, and the room that used to move fast now kept pausing, waiting for something that was not there. By noon, one of his senior partners called, voice tight, asking why a risk report had not been flagged earlier, and when Richard turned to his team, no one answered right away, just a quiet glance passed between them before someone finally said, "She flagged things before they became problems." That was the first moment it shifted, not loud, not dramatic, just a thin crack in his control. He walked past Naomi's empty desk, noticed how clean it was, no clutter, no trace, like she had planned to disappear without leaving anything behind. And suddenly the silence from last night did not feel passive anymore. It felt intentional. Then his assistant came back, slower this time, holding a printed email from an external firm, asking for confirmation on a deal Naomi had been privately stabilizing for weeks, a deal Richard did not even know was at risk. And at the bottom of the message was a single line, polite but cold, asking who would be replacing her now. Richard stared at it longer than he should have, because for the first time, he was not asking why she left, he was asking something worse. How much of his world had been quietly depending on her before he even noticed she existed? 3 weeks later, Naomi Carter was not hiding. She was sitting at the center of a long glass table in a midtown conference room, sunlight cutting across her face as a group of senior consultants leaned in, listening, not interrupting, not questioning, just waiting for her to finish. She spoke calmly, direct, no extra words, and when she stopped, one of them nodded and said, "That is exactly what we needed." And the others followed, not out of politeness, but because they meant it. The shift was quiet but undeniable. People adjusted in their seats when she talked. Phones went face down. Attention moved toward her without effort. Just weeks ago she had been dismissed in a crowded room. Now she was being introduced as someone who sees problems before they happen. And no one laughed this time. After the meeting, a partner walked beside her, offering a longer-term contract, saying they had heard about her work, saying her name like it already carried weight. Across the city, Richard sat in another meeting that felt heavier, slower, every decision dragging, every answer incomplete. And then someone mentioned a competitor suddenly stabilizing a deal that should have collapsed, a deal he recognized, a deal Naomi had been quietly handling before she left. He did not react right away, but his jaw tightened, because the timeline did not make sense unless she had stepped in somewhere else. Later that night, he saw her name again, this time in a forwarded email, not as an assistant, not as support, but as the lead contact, the one everyone was copying, the one people were thanking. He stared at the screen longer than he wanted to admit, because it was no longer about something missing, It was about something moving forward without him, and for the first time, the question was not what she had been doing for him, but who she was becoming without him, and how long before everyone else started choosing her over him. The room went quiet the second Richard Whitmore walked in, but not for him this time. The attention shifted past him, toward the far end of the table where Naomi Carter was already seated, reviewing a document like she had been there long before he arrived. He slowed down, just slightly, because no one stood to greet him first, no one rushed, and when one of the senior partners spoke, it was not to him, it was to her. "Naomi, should we begin?" And she gave a small nod, calm, controlled, like. This was her space now. Richard pulled out his chair, the sound sharper than it should have been, trying to reclaim rhythm. But the meeting moved without waiting for him. Numbers, strategy, decisions flowing through Naomi's voice, steady and precise. He interrupted once, questioning a projection, expecting hesitation, but she did not look at him right away. She finished her sentence, then turned, meeting his eyes without tension. "It has already been stress-tested," she said, simple, final, and the room accepted it without debate. That was the moment it shifted, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because he realized he was the one catching up. A few minutes later, someone asked for clarification on a risk point, and instead of turning to Richard like they used to, they turned to Naomi, waiting, trusting, and she answered without effort, like she had been carrying this level all along. He leaned back, jaw tight, watching how easily she moved through what used to be his control, how no one questioned her place. And for the first time, the memory of that night hit differently, not as a win, but as a mistake he could not take back. After the meeting, he stepped into her path, forcing a moment, lowering his voice. "You left without saying anything," but she did not react to the edge in his tone, did not defend, did not explain, just looked at him with the same calm that unsettled him before. "I said enough," she replied, and there was no anger in it, which made it worse. Someone called her name from behind, not him, someone else, waiting on her decision, and she turned away first, leaving him standing there again. Only this time it was not dismissal, it was distance he could, not close. And as he watched her walk back into a room that now moved around her, one thought pressed harder than anything else. If this was who she was now, then what had she really been holding back when she stood silent in front of him that night? The next deal was supposed to be routine, a high-stakes acquisition meeting with 3 firms in the room and millions on the line. The kind of space where Richard Whitmore usually controlled every word, every pause, every outcome. But this time something shifted the second Naomi Carter walked in and took her seat across from him. Not beside, not behind, across. And the way the others greeted her was different, not polite, not casual, but direct, focused, like she was the one they needed answers from. The presentation began, and within minutes a complication surfaced, a financial risk buried deep in the projections, something Richard's team had overlooked, and for a brief second the room tilted toward uncertainty, eyes moving, tension rising, until Naomi leaned forward, calm, steady, and said, "It has already been addressed." And then she walked them through a solution so clean, so prepared, that even the opposing firm nodded before she finished. Richard tried to step in, to reframe control, adding to her explanation, but one of the investors gently cut him off, turning back to Naomi. "Can you clarify the timeline?" And just like that, his voice was no longer the final one in the room. It was subtle, but everyone felt it, the shift in who they trusted to lead. Documents were passed, signatures discussed, and when the lead partner finally spoke, it was not to Richard, it was to her. "We are comfortable moving forward under your structure." And that sentence landed heavier than anything else that day, because it made something painfully clear. She was not supporting the deal, she was defining it. Richard sat back, watching the room move around her, realizing this was not temporary, not situational. This was recognition he could not interrupt. After the meeting, as people gathered their things, he overheard 2 executives speaking in low voices, one of them saying she was the one holding his operations together for years, and the other replying, "Then why was she ever in the background?" And that question lingered, longer than anything else, because Richard did not have an answer. He stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the room fading behind him, and for the first time, It was not just about losing control in a meeting. It was about something deeper slipping out of reach, something structural, something he had depended on without ever seeing it clearly. And just as he pulled out his phone, another message came through. A formal notice that Naomi had been invited to lead a new division partnership that directly intersected with his core business. And he stopped walking, because the implication hit immediately. If she accepted, she would not just be outside his control, she would be positioned directly against him. And the question that followed was sharper than anything before. How much of his success had actually been built on something he no longer had? He did not go home that night. Instead, he sat alone in his office, lights dim, the city stretching wide beyond the glass. And for the first time in years, Richard Whitmore opened files he had never bothered to question before. Not summaries, not final reports, but the raw threads, the early drafts, the internal notes, the parts no one ever looked at once success was confirmed. At first it felt routine, just checking details. But then patterns started to appear, small at first, almost easy to ignore, until they were not. A risk flagged weeks before it became public, a contract clause rewritten before a dispute ever surfaced, a deal rerouted quietly to avoid a loss no one ever knew was possible. And next to each of those turning points, there was one name, not highlighted, not credited, just present, consistent. Naomi Carter. He leaned back slowly, the chair creaking under him, because those were not minor details. Those were the moments he had built his reputation on, the times. People called him sharp, decisive, ahead of everyone else. He clicked deeper, opening an old acquisition file, one that had been praised as one of his strongest wins. And there it was again, an internal message chain where Naomi had outlined a flaw in the original strategy and suggested an adjustment that he had approved without reading closely. And suddenly that memory shifted. What he thought was instinct, what he thought was leadership, was something else entirely. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of it. A message from a former executive who had recently left his firm, short and direct. You should have paid more attention to who was actually keeping things stable. And for a moment, he did not respond, because he was already seeing it. He stood up, pacing once, then again, the room feeling smaller, tighter, because this was no longer about one missed detail. It was structural, it was layered through years of decisions, outcomes, credibility. Another file opened, another instance, another quiet correction she had made before anything broke, and it became impossible to deny. The thing he lost was not an assistant, not support, but the system that made him look like he never failed. He stopped at the window, staring out without really seeing, because the realization settled in heavier than anything before. He had not just misjudged her, he had built an entire identity on work that was never fully his. His phone buzzed again, a calendar alert he did not remember setting, a closed door strategy session scheduled for the next morning, and at the bottom of the invite list was her name, not as staff, not as support, but as the lead presenter, and his hand tightened slightly around the phone, because this time, when he walked into that room, he would not be facing the woman he dismissed. He would be facing the truth he had been standing on all along. He did not wait for the meeting this time. He went to her first, catching Naomi Carter just outside the conference room before anyone else arrived. His voice lower than usual but faster, less controlled. We need to talk. And for the first time, there was no authority in it, only urgency. She stopped, but she did not turn fully toward him, just enough to acknowledge he was there, her expression steady, unreadable, like she had already decided how much of this moment she would allow. He stepped closer, words coming quicker now. I looked at everything, the files, the deals. You were behind all of it. You should have said something. And the sentence hung there, because even as he said it, it sounded wrong. Naomi finally faced him, calm, no tension in her shoulders, no rush in her breath. You never asked, she said. Simple, not defensive, just true. And that landed harder than anything he had prepared. He tried again, shifting tone, softer. Now, then let me fix this. Come back. We can reset this properly. But before he could finish, a colleague approached her from down the hall, greeting her by name, handing her a folder, asking for her approval on a decision that clearly did not include him. And she took it without hesitation, scanning quickly, nodding once. And the colleague thanked her and left, not even glancing at Richard. That was the moment it became undeniable. The space around her no longer belonged to him. and whatever influence he once had did not reach her anymore. He exhaled, slower now, trying to regain control. You are making this harder than it needs to be. But she did not react to the pressure, did not match his tone, just held his gaze with the same quiet steadiness that had unsettled him from the beginning. No, she said. I just stopped making it easy. And there was no anger in it, which made it final. He stood there, realizing the old dynamic was gone. There was no version of this where he could direct her, define her, or pull her back into place. A door opened behind her, someone calling her in, waiting on her, not him, and she turned toward it without hesitation, pausing only for a second before stepping inside, leaving him in the hallway with a silence that no longer felt like something he could control. As the door closed, his phone buzzed again. A notification confirming that she had officially accepted the leadership role in the new division, one that would now directly compete with his core operations. And this time the realization did not come slowly. It hit all at once, because whatever came next would not be about fixing the past. It would be about facing her as someone he could no longer reach, no longer influence, and possibly no longer stop. The room was smaller this time. No audience, no partners, just a quiet office with glass walls and the city moving outside. And for the first time since everything shifted, Richard Whitmore closed the door behind him and faced Naomi Carter without distraction, without status to hide behind. She stood near the window, reviewing a document, not rushing, not reacting to his presence until she finished the page and set it down. And even that small pause made it clear he was no longer the one setting the pace. I know now, he said, voice steady but thinner than before. What you were doing, what you carried, I was wrong. And the words sat in the space between them, not dramatic, just direct. She looked at him, calm, no anger, no satisfaction, just clarity, and that made it harder, because there was nothing to push against. He stepped closer, not aggressive, just uncertain in a way he had never been. You should have been more than that position. I should have seen it. And for a second it sounded like something close to an apology, something late but real. Naomi held his gaze, then spoke without hesitation. I was more, she said, simple, firm. You just needed me small. The sentence landed clean, no emotion attached, just truth, and it left no room to argue. He inhaled slowly, trying to hold on to something. Then let me change that now. But she shook her head once, not dismissive, just final. You do not get to change me after you benefited from not seeing me. And there it was, clear, direct, no softness to reinterpret. The silence that followed was different, not uncertain, not waiting. It was closed. He looked at her like he was searching for any opening, any version of her that still fit the past, but it was gone, replaced by someone who did not need his recognition anymore. There is no version of this where I go back, she added, quieter now, but no less certain. And there is no version of my future that depends on you. That was the moment it fully settled, not as a shock, but as something undeniable. He had not just lost her presence. He had lost any place in what came next. He nodded once, slow, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to negotiate, only something to accept. Naomi picked up her folder, turning toward the door, and just before she stepped past him, she paused, not to reconsider, but to make one last thing clear. You did not lose me when I left, she said. You lost me when I stopped needing to be heard. And then she walked out, leaving the door slightly open behind her, not as an invitation, but as a quiet end, and for the first time, the silence she left behind did not feel like something that could ever be filled again. Months later, the room was full again, but the energy had changed, quieter, sharper, more intentional, and Naomi Carter stood at the front of it not as someone proving her place, but as someone who already belonged there. She moved through the presentation with ease, not rushing, not performing, just clear, steady, and every decision in that room leaned toward her without effort, because trust had already been built long before she walked in. People listened when she spoke, not because they had to, but because they knew she saw what others missed, and when the meeting ended, they did not question her direction, they followed it. Across the city, in a building that once carried his name with weight, Richard Whitmore sat in a quieter office than before, fewer voices outside his door, fewer interruptions, fewer moments where people waited on his decision first, and the silence there felt different now. Not powerful, not controlled, just present. He still had his position, his title, but something underneath it had shifted, something he could not rebuild with strategy or force. He watched a recording of her latest presentation that had been circulating among partners, not because he needed to, but because he could not ignore it anymore. And as her voice carried through the speakers, calm, precise, he saw it clearly, not as competition, not as loss in business terms, but as the full shape of what he had never taken the time to understand. There was no anger left in him now, no urgency to fix anything. Only a quiet recognition settling in where certainty used to be, because the gap between who she was and who he thought she was could not be closed anymore. Back in her world, Naomi stepped outside after the meeting, the late afternoon sun cutting across the glass buildings, her phone buzzing with new offers, new opportunities, but she did not rush to answer. She just paused for a moment, breathing in the space she had built for herself, a life that no longer needed validation, no longer needed permission, no longer carried the weight of being unseen. She was not thinking about him, not measuring anything against the past, because there was nothing left there that defined her. And somewhere else in the city, Richard stood by his window again, looking out at the same skyline, but seeing it differently now, not as something he controlled, but as something he had misunderstood for too long. And the truth settled in quietly, without resistance, without denial, because it was too clear to ignore. He had not lost her in that moment when she walked away. He had lost her long before that. And by the time he finally saw her, she no longer needed to be seen.